to be with us and support us through the next 2 weeks. And in the meantime, I had to make preparations for my granddaughter's funeral. Something I never thought in my life I would be able to be ever having to do. In the middle of August, there was a memorial held for Janice. There were several hundred of the people in that church that day. People from all around the community were there to show their support and send their condolences to our family she'd lost. A week later, we had Josie, my wife's sisters, and nieces from New Mexico came to comfort us and help us with our time in need. We finally received Janice's body the last week of August so we could put our beautiful angel to rest. And then the day came that we were going to see her body for the first time at the funeral home. This was one of the hardest things for my family to have to do, and bear that moment, and let that moment before that, and many more we would later have to endure. It was like our time stood still. Our Janice wasn't running around smiling, laughing, and being the loving little girl she was. All of our hearts were broken, even more than we could have possibly been. Janice was buried on August 30th, 2014, next to her great-grandpa. And this was yet another moment we never thought we would be experiencing, losing a granddaughter and having to bury her. It is one of the toughest things that we had to undergo. At noon the same day, our family in New Mexico released purple balloons in Janice's honor and remembrance. Janice had a huge family who would never be able to forget her. She will always be remembered forever. We were all so sad and angry and heartbroken that we will never get to see our granddaughter finish elementary, high school, graduate, attend college, get married, and have children of her own. We will never be able to be with us for her birthday, holidays, or any of our family functions. We bring flowers to her grave every single year to celebrate her birthday. Our granddaughter's life was taken away too soon. Before we ever get to experience anything, our lives could possibly never be the same again. The pain and suffering we had to endure had left us different after all of this. A huge piece of us will always be missing now. No words could remotely begin to explain the amount of pain that we felt, let alone the entire month of August. But I hope this letter can shine a little bit of light on how we feel and what we endured. This is my letter for me and my wife. And I got one from her aunt down in Mexico. This is to whom may concern. I would like to say a little something about my niece, Janice. And I only got to know her for a little short time. I only saw her once, but she was a happy little girl. Since her life was taken away, she won't be able to know her grandmother's side of the tribe. It was trouble. She won't be able to see our culture is, and won't be able to participate in her way of life. There's a lot of things I would like to say. It would take a long time. She is in a much happier place now, and God is taking care of her. And this is from her aunt, Maria Toya. And I got one on my cell phone here. I got that last night. And this is from her great aunt. Losing a child is a life-changing event. Such a tragedy should never be bestowed on anyone. Sickness, an accident, or any kind of hurt on your child is heartbreaking enough. But what the man did to my grandniece is beyond any sane person could fathom. This sweet little baby had no idea what he had planned. He hurt a baby girl and took her life in such a terrible way. He needs to be locked up away for life. He should never be allowed to be even, he should never be allowed to even look at another child as long as he lives. The animal has taken our little girl's future and broke the hearts of our entire family. Please be just and lock this prison away for life. So you can't hurt another child. And this is from his great aunt, Fanny Lucero. And like I said, there could be more letters, but probably would have been about 50 letters, but I told him we can't do that, so. Because in our family now, there's way over 1,000 people, way over. That's it, Judge.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm going to read a letter from Melanie Davis. Hello, my name is Melanie. I am the second oldest sibling to Janice Wright. I am coming to you to not only share my story, but also for my daughter, Janice's niece. First, I will start with how it affected my daughter's life. When I look at my daughter, I see confusion in her eyes on how she barely got to grow up with her auntie. She was very young when everything happened. But one thing she does remember is how she would always play with her. And now my daughter isn't able to grow up with her auntie or even have that bond. Secondly, is my story on how losing her affected myself. On November 17th, the baby of the family was born. I remember the day that she was born, even up until she left this world. Janice was so full of life and also sass. My mom would always tell me Janice reminded me of myself. Her own little Melanie Jr. I loved my sister. She was the baby of the family, and our family is close, oriented family. We celebrate every major holiday and birthdays. The first year was the hardest for my family, considering on how we do celebrate. Knowing we lost a member of our family, it felt as if we had nothing to be happy for. Being an older sibling, you'd think you'd be able to experience all the great experiences that come with being an older sibling. But I am no longer able to see Janice grow into that beautiful girl I knew she would have been. Thank you, Melanie Davis. This is from Coraline Amajera, an open letter, or Coralise, excuse me. My name is Coralise. I am the oldest sibling of Janice Wright. I am also the mother of her now 9-year-old nephew, Rayon. I write this letter for not only myself, but for my son as well. I am unfortunately unable to make it to the sentencing, but I hope this letter will allow my voice to be heard, even when my presence cannot be. Words cannot even begin to express how losing Janice has impacted my family's life, but I will continue my best to explain how it has greatly changed everything forever. Firstly, I'll start with my son. When he was first born, my sister Janice was not very happy that there was going to be someone else around, taking the attention away from her. She's a year older than Rayon. But as time progressed, the bond that she and Rayon developed was like a sibling bond. From that moment on, those two were partners in crime, two peas in a pod and birds of a feather. Their bond was truly unbreakable one. From matching onesies pajamas to putting makeup on each other and creating mischief. Those two were always side by side. Janice was the one to teach Rayon how to ride his bike without training wheels for the first time. Rayon loved and looked up to Janice so much. She taught him how to be brave. She always knew how to get him to listen. Losing her broke Rayon's heart. Watching my son try to comprehend at such a young age that his best friend, Auntie, had passed away was one of the worst things I've ever had to watch and go through. Ron and Janice were supposed to grow up together, protect each other. Janice was supposed to be that person that he could go to when he truly needed some guidance from a non-parental figure. Now my son's life is forever changed. He no longer has the opportunity to grow up with his auntie, who is more like a sister. He can't protect her as they get older, which I know he will never be able to forget and will cherish so deeply. He randomly will burst out with stories of her or just walk and talk about her. I catch him at times looking at pictures that we have of her with such love and sadness in his eyes. How do you get over losing someone so close to your heart that you thought you would grow up and be around forever? Then there's me. Being the oldest sibling, you can't even begin to imagine the intense pain and overwhelming emotions I felt. As the oldest sister, my job was to guide my younger siblings in the right direction, be a good role model, and to protect them. The pain I felt knowing I was not able to watch over and protect my baby sister was unbearable. I tried so hard to be the strong backbone for my mom and siblings, but soon enough, all those feelings consumed me. I was drowning in emotions. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. What is life without our precious Janice? The baby of all of us siblings, the sassy, outspoken, and beautiful bright star of our life. Now we don't get to watch her grow up, see her get her first boyfriend, attend her first school dance, graduate high school, go to college, get married, have children of her own. I don't get to help her through the tough times when she needs a big sister or when she needs to come to me for sisterly advice. I will never again will I get to hear her sweet voice, see her beautiful smile, hear her laugh, watch her interacting and growing up with my son, hear her tell me how much she loves me, hug her. I never even got the opportunity to tell my baby sister how much I loved her, and this breaks my heart. She was taken away from us far too soon. You never expect things like this to happen to your family until it does. Then there are no words that can even moderately begin to explain how the pain feels, the pain that never goes away. How do you handle something like that? She had barely even gotten to experience in life, and now she will never get to, ever again. My family will heal as time passes, but there will always be a big part of us that will be missing because we lost Janice. Life just can't be what it ever was before this happened. It changed us all. All of our lives will never be the same without her.
And Your Honor, for the record, State handed forward some photographs from the family for the court to review.
My name is Denise Wright. I am the mother of Janice Wright. The day she was born was a special day for our family. You could tell she was going to be a special little girl. Her smile and friendliness would be brighten up anyone's day. She was the sunshine in our family, and now it's gone. There are no words to explain our pain and loss. I will never get to experience seeing her grow up to become a beautiful woman. I will miss out on her first kiss, her first boyfriend, school dances, and graduating from high school and college. But most of all, I will miss out on her wedding and getting her ready and her first child. I will never get to see. How do you explain in so many words how much you will miss out in her life and never will get to experience? She was the friendliest girl in the park and always made the new kids feel welcome who moved into the park, and always introduced them to the other kids. Her father couldn't be here, and he misses her so much and loves her. And he has no words to explain for his pain or loss either. I will always miss her and love her. But now she has no life to experience, and I feel that. He shouldn't have one either. There's another letter that that my other daughter wrote. Sky Wright. This was like a while back ago. It says, "Dear Janice, we miss you so much. I wish I could see you again, or even restart July and be with you all the time. I wish I can touch your short hair again. We all miss you, love you. I do hope
I do hope you see this not. I will try to write a note for you. I still love you. No matter what, I wish I was dead and not you. Why did you take the bullet? It was all my fault that you are gone, since never said I love you back when I was gone. I really wish you were here right now so I could get you from school every day, but you missed first grade. I wish you were missing than dead. I hope Gabe gets what he deserves. I know I'm a bad speller, but I will hurt him no matter what if I have to. I will avenge your death and make him pay for whatever he did. It's almost time for me to go to academic study hall. Well, I wish I could have saw you at the first day of first grade. Well, Mom really misses you. She wishes she could have you back and have you being held by her side. We all miss you, but I will miss you more. But I hope I see you in my dreams, and I miss you. I love you, Boo. I will make him pay." And how old is she?
Well, that was about 4 years ago.
So she would be how old?
She's 16 now, so.
About 12.
And then I just brought this too because someone gave this to us. And it kind of explains her to a T. That's all I have.
We would like that back, Your Honor. Thank you.
Your Honor, that's it, please.
Is the state asking the court to impose the conditions detailed in the pre-sentence investigation as well?
Right, Your Honor, in Appendix F.
And at some point, Ms. Lacrosse, if you can address any issues with Appendix F and legal financial obligations. It's my understanding that you wanted a break before we continue so that you can finish setting up. Is that right?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we'll take a break at this time, and this will just be long enough for you to set up your material. So,
And use the restroom?
well, I guess the question is this. I don't know if we need to bring Mr. Gaeta back to the jail or not, so that's the question.
They're gonna stay.
Okay, but yes, if you need to go to the restroom, set up, that's fine. Thank you.
All rise. rise. Court is now in session.
Please be seated. Ms. LaCrosse?
Thank you, Your Honor. If I could call Dr. Terry Lee to stand.
Face me, raise your right hand. You swear affirm the testimony you're about to give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Okay, have a seat, sir.
Would you like a glass of water?
Okay.
You're good?
Yes.
If you could state your name, please, for the record and spell it.
Terry Lee, Terryllee.
Okay, thank you. Now, you're a medical doctor, correct?
Yes.
Okay, could you tell us your occupation, profession in more detail?
Yeah, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist.
And how long have you been a child and adolescent psychiatrist?
Let's see, I finished my training in 1993,
Okay.
so
Where did you, what is your educational background?
I went to college at the University of Minnesota, have a degree in psychology, went to medical school at the University of Minnesota, did 4 years of residency in general psychiatry at the University of Washington, and did 2 years of specialty training in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Washington.
Okay, all right. And do you have any additional licenses or certifications?
Well, I'm board certified in general psychiatry. I'm also
Okay.
board certified in child and adolescent psychiatry.
Okay, all right. Now, you've worked extensively in the field of child and adolescent psychiatry, correct?
Yes,
And you've done, you're published, is that true?
yes.
Okay, and about how many articles, give or take, are you published? Or
Well, I'm not really sure, actually.
Okay.
It's in my CV.
Okay,
I have a
that's-
copy of that.
a significant amount, correct?
Fair number, yeah.
Okay, and those relate, most of your work is dealing with just your publications are with child and adolescent psychiatry, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this case involves your expertise regarding looking at what we call the Miller factors, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, and have you had previous experience doing that?
Yes.
Okay, and how frequently have you looked at that?
Well, I've looked at adolescent brain development prior to the Miller ruling.
Okay.
It's just something I've been involved with, and then since the Miller ruling, I've looked at I've been involved in a handful of cases.
All right, and let's see. So, have you specifically interviewed or spoken with Mr. Gaeta?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And when you were speaking with Mr. Gaeta, you were looking at adolescent and child brain development, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Did you look at did you review or look at anything other than speaking with Mr. Gaeta?
Yes, I looked at some other records. These include the Kitsap County Superior Court charging papers, the mitigation packet that was provided by you to me, Western State Hospital records from the Center for Forensic Services. So there was a competency assessment in February 2017. There's another competency assessment in August of 2017. Looked at medical records, Front Street Clinic mental health records from Anthony Huang, Kitsap County Juvenile Detention records, Kitsap County Jail mental health records, Alaska court records relating to a domestic violence order involving his family, and Indiana Child Protective Service records. I also spoke to you and his mother.
Okay. And so now I want to talk to you. You have here a PowerPoint, and that has to do with, you're going to explain and talk to the court about the adolescent brain development, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it would be better, Your Honor, if I just approach and have him go through the PowerPoint.
Unless there's any concern with that process.
Nothing to say.
Okay.
All right, so in typical brain development, by age 6, the brain is about 95% of the adult size. However, the gray matter part, the thinking part of the brain, continues to grow throughout childhood, and there are extra connections that are made in the brain. The gray matter volume, the amount of gray matter, peaks in the preteens at about puberty. And at this time, the brain has great potential for skill development. Then in adolescence, the gray matter begins pruning or thinning and becomes more specialized and efficient and appears more like adult gray matter in about the early 20s or so. The frontal lobes also begin a period of growth and maturation around the time of adolescence.
Okay, Your Honor, may I approach just to help you so that you don't have to turn back?
Okay.
There's a copy of that, okay?
Okay.
So here we're talking about the typical brain development of individuals, and could you, so from this slide here, we're saying that the brain is not completely developed during childhood and adolescence, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now let's move to the next slide.
Okay. So the point of this slide is just to show that the gray matter volume evolves and develops over time. This goes up to age 20, but it actually continues. Brain development continues through the mid-20s at least.
Okay. All right.
So this is just test, so to speak. So what emotion is this person feeling? So people can kind of think of what emotion this person is feeling.
Okay.
Try to name it, identify the emotion.
What's the significance of having this here?
Oh, it's just something to think about while people. We'll come back to this.
We'll come back to this?
Yeah, but the idea is just to think about what emotion this person is feeling.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
So while you think of that, this is a picture of a brain. So this has been colored. So the brain is like a boxing glove, like this. So there's like two halves of the brain. So we're kind of looking at like this side. It's like this type of a view of the brain. And the front part, it's labeled there, is called the frontal lobe. So the blue part there is the
Okay.
frontal lobe.
All right. And we're going to talk more about the importance of the frontal lobe.
Yeah.
Okay. So this here, could you tell us about the frontal lobe and what it's responsible for?
Yeah, so the frontal lobe completes development in about the mid-20s. It's the last area of the brain to develop. It's not fully developed in adolescence, and it's the part of the it's involved with many functions, but some of the functions have to do with planning, judging, starting and stopping actions, anticipating the outcomes and consequences of possible actions, and inhibiting and suppressing inappropriate social behavior.
So this part is not developed during adolescence?
It's not developed during adolescence.
Okay. All right. Tell us about the limbic system.
So this is a cutaway of the brain. So now it's the same view, but looking at the middle. So it's like if you cut right down the middle of the brain, and you're looking now at the inside of the brain.
Okay, so this diagram here, and all those, the purple, the yellow, and the red, are that all part of the limbic system?
Yeah. So these are
Okay.
different parts of the brain involved with the limbic system.
Okay, so what is the significance of the limbic system?
So this is the part of the brain that deals with emotions. It manages levels of arousal. And it's involved with motivating and reinforcing behaviors. So when the limbic system is fully developed, along with the frontal lobe, it keeps people from overheating. It maintains control of behavior. Okay, so it both works with the frontal lobes to manage behavior, and there's also the part of the brain that deals with emotions.
Okay, and that is not fully developed in adolescence?
It is not fully developed in adolescence. And because because the frontal lobes are not fully developed in adolescence, the limbic system sometimes stands in for part of the frontal lobe executive functioning. Meaning, since the frontal lobe isn't fully developed and can't control, can't think, can't anticipate, sometimes the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, will stand in and try to control some behaviors. As a result, adolescents are more prone to impulsive behavior, over or under reaction, and mood swings.
So what we're saying here is that adolescents, their executive functioning in their frontal lobe, which has them making better choices, better control, better reasoning, correct?
Yeah.
Is not developed, not working, and so the limbic system, which is more emotional based,
Yes.
is the one that is regulating decision making,
Yes.
stands in to do
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're back to this picture.
Okay, so now back to this picture, and what emotion is this person feeling? And this was actually part of a test,
Okay.
part of a study, so to speak.
Okay.
If you go to the next slide. And so this was a small study in which individuals were asked to identify the emotion in the photograph. And 100% of the adults in the study correctly identified the emotion of fear. Okay? They correctly identified this person as being afraid or fearful, but only 50% of the adolescents correctly identified fear. Other people labeled the emotion as sadness, confusion, or shock.
Okay,
So what they concluded was that adolescents don't read emotions as well as adults. And when problem-solving emotional material, adolescents tend to use the brain's emotional processing regions and less of the brain's planning regions. So another way of looking at this, so it wasn't just a study looking at this picture and asking, on a paper and pencil test, what emotion was the person feeling. There was actually, the subjects were actually put into a brain scanner during the study. So you can go to the next slide.
okay.
This shows us that on the right-hand side, you see the adult brain used more of the frontal lobe. Okay?
So whether these are scans of people looking at that picture, correct?
And
Okay.
naming the emotion.
And naming the emotion.
So,
okay.
so when trying to problem solve this emotion reading task, adults use the frontal lobe of the brain.
Okay.
And then on the left-hand side, you see that the adolescents didn't really use so much of the frontal lobe as much as the limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain.
Okay.
So this is showing qualitatively that there are differences in adolescent and adult brains. When it comes to problem solving, it's not just that it's not as developed, but really adolescents use a different part of their brain when faced with emotional problems.
Okay. All right, so what's this about dopamine? Could you tell us?
Okay, so dopamine is a neurotransmitter, so that's a brain chemical. So the brain uses this to chemicals to communicate. The different brain cells communicate with each other through neurotransmitters or brain chemicals. So dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters or brain chemicals that's used for communication. And it doesn't function, again, fully at adult levels while in adolescence. So the way the adolescent brain works, the dopamine communication system is just developing.
Okay, and what is, I'm sorry, could you repeat that again as far as the significance of dopamine? Are we going to get more into what that is?
So there's a brain communication system. So the brain cells communicate with each other through brain chemicals, and
Okay.
dopamine is one of them. And so
Okay.
there's a dopamine communication system that's not fully developed in adolescence.
Okay.
Okay.
Alright.
So dopamine is similar to adrenaline in its ability to rev up the brain, and it's involved with multiple processes, including memory, concentration, problem solving, and pleasure.
So the dopamine is what would make those areas of the brain work correctly and as an adult, at an adult level. But as a juvenile, there is not enough dopamine that is in the brain at this time, correct?
Well, the system doesn't work efficiently in adolescence.
Okay.
So there's dopamine, but it doesn't. The system itself isn't as well developed. And so, as a result, there's what some people call the dopamine-mediated reward deficiency syndrome. So this is a condition similar to addiction and compulsive behavior in adults, but again, this is just typical brain development. So as a result of this, adolescents are no longer stimulated by activities that thrilled them as younger children, and they also engage in greater risk and higher stimulation in efforts to achieve similar levels of excitement. So this explains some of the behavior that you see in adolescents, in typical adolescents.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're going to talk about, so these are like research-based studies looking at brain and neurotransmitters. There's another line of research that just has to do with how do people think, how do adolescents think compared to adults.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So this was a study funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and it looked at 900 individuals from 5 different sites, and they were asking the question, at what age do individuals exhibit adult levels of maturity?
Okay.
Okay. So this first slide shows that impulsivity declines with age, that you see there's a gradual decrease in impulsivity, and then it decreases sharply around age 25 or 26 or so in most individuals. Okay.
And this is common accepted theories and knowledge within your field, correct?
Yes, yes. And risk perceptions, so how risky do you view a behavior? How risky do individuals see different behaviors? It declines, so again, teenagers tend to see things as less risky than either younger children or adults.
And would that take us back to because their frontal lobe is not fully developed and they're
the
analyzing?
dopamine system, right, so both the frontal lobe, right, is not as well developed, so they don't think through things as well.
Okay.
They're more emotional, so there's more emotion-based, and then the dopamine system is not as well developed.
Okay.
Okay. While risk perception declines, it then increases after mid-adolescence. Sensation seeking increases and then declines through adolescence. So again, that's sort of the kind of being revved up or trying more and more things to stimulate or excite or make the brain stimulated.
Okay. And so that declines throughout adolescence as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what this slide has to do with is the differences in looking and thinking. So the blue lines are so time is on the axis, the left-hand axis, and this is age on the bottom. So this shows that that's how much time individuals spend solving a problem.
In seconds, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. And so the blue are the easy questions, and the green are the harder questions. And so the point of this slide is to show that as we get older, we are better able to identify what's an easy question versus a hard question. And if it's a hard question, I better spend more time thinking about this. Or you could also apply this to like a risky situation. If you were outside and something difficult came up, you were faced with a hard decision. The point here is that as you get older, you realize that you're facing a difficult question, and you spend more time thinking about something before you act.
Okay. And that's, I'm assuming, because your frontal lobe is more developed, so you're able to recognize the more complexity of issues, correct?
Yeah, you're able to think through like what'll happen if I'm not careful here.
Okay. And adolescents don't have that ability to do that to such an
Correct.
extent.
Right.
Okay.
So just to summarize then, compared to adults, adolescents perceive risks differently. They're more easily influenced by peers. They're more impulsive. They're less skilled at problem solving. They're less able to foresee the probable consequences of their behavior or reason about alternative behaviors. And as a result, they're less culpable.
Okay, and this is based on biological makeup of a young person's mind, correct?
Yes.
So everything that you've talked about, the development of the brain at time of an adolescence, these are the consequences of not having the fully developed brain.
Yeah, these are things that you see in adolescents because their brain is not as well developed as that of mature adults.
Okay. What do we have here?
Oh, this is just a Supreme Court ruling that
Yeah.
that talks about this, and we talked about Miller, but actually it's been known for a while that that adolescents aren't the same as mature adults.
Okay.
So this is a majority opinion for Justice John Paul Stevens. Thus, the court has already endorsed the proposition that less culpability should attach to a crime committed to a juvenile than to a comparable crime committed by an adult. The basis of this conclusion is too obvious to require extensive explanation. Inexperience, less education, and less intelligence make the teenager less able to evaluate the consequences of his or her conduct, while at the same time, he or she is more apt to be motivated by a mere emotion or peer pressure than is an adult. The reason why juveniles are not trusted with the privileges and responsibilities of an adult also explain why their irresponsible conduct is not as morally reprehensible as that of an adult.
So we've known that through the court system for a while.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And this here is supporting conclusions. Talk about this right here.
Yeah. So just, there may be lies in reasoning where we know that adolescents are not functioning like mature adults. So another area that one could look at is car rentals. So back in the day, actually, car rental agencies would not rent cars to individuals younger than 25 years old. Now, it is possible to do that, to rent a car if you're less than 25 years old, but you're not allowed to rent high-value vehicles, and you often have to pay much more money to rent a vehicle. So there's, essentially insurance data then, or actuarial data showing that when you turn 25, there is a qualitative change in the way that you drive a car, the way you assess risks, the way you think through things. And in fact, historically then, young people were actually protected from renting cars.
Now let's talk about depression.
Yeah, so I included this just because at the time of the referral offense, Gabe was still recovering from a severe episode of depression.
And I'll have you talk more about that. Based upon your interview and meeting with Gabe and all of the other outside sources that you looked into and that you, the information that you gathered, did you come to a conclusion, a diagnosis with Gabe?
Yes, at the time he was suffering from depression, major depression.
Okay.
And that was a diagnosis that he had from his outside providers as well. And he was subsequently diagnosed with depression when he was ordered to Western State Hospital for competency evaluation and restoration.
So when you say the word depression, a lot of people suffer from depression. Was this the same, or do you see anything different about the depression that Gabe was suffering from? Could you explain that?
Yeah. So when I use the term major depression, I'm speaking of a diagnostic code, a diagnosis, not just in, we use the term depression in common everyday language, but when a psychiatrist uses the term major depression, then we're talking about a diagnosis, a clinical presentation.
Okay.
So that this is characterized by depressed mood, problems with sleep, problems with appetite, low energy, slow thinking, possibly negative outlook for the future, sometimes safety concerns. In Gabe's case, he suffered from, it seems that he suffered from a severe depression, and when he was treated at a Western State Hospital, in addition to being treated with antipsychotic or antidepressant medication, he was also treated with an antipsychotic medication, indicating it was a very severe form of depression that he was suffering.
Okay. And how did this severe form of depression manifest itself with Gabe? Did you see how he presented?
At the time I interviewed him, he was pretty slowed in his thinking.
Okay.
He was confused about some things. He didn't say much. He didn't say much spontaneously. When he said things, he used short phrases. Now, prior to the referral offense, my understanding is that he became severely depressed, stopped going to school, spent most of his time in his room by himself, stopped socializing with others, stopped socializing with his family.
So that's why you included this part here in your PowerPoint, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so,
So this is a couple of studies, actually looking at many studies of young people under the age of 25, so teenagers and adults less than 25 years old, compared their brain functioning to non-depressed individuals the same age. And what they found is that there are altered activations, so different parts of the brain respond differently, and there's altered connectivity, so some of the connections are also not the same as in non-depressed individuals. And so the repercussions are, again, these areas that we've been talking about: emotion regulation, so the ability to manage your emotions; cognitive control, so your brain, again, telling you what you shouldn't do; cognitive control of emotions, so being able to put the brakes on one's emotions; and reward-based decision-making.
so we already have an adolescent who's already hindered by a brain that's not functioning 100%. And now when you add the fact that the individual is suffering from severe depression, it's even making the brain work worse, correct?
Yes, the brain is not working as efficiently. Yeah.
Okay. And your last line there, that as the person ages, that won't have the same effect.
The research is still pretty new, but that was hypothesized, or that was suggested by the data, that with maturity and as depression gets better, then it's possible that these differences may reduce.
Okay. What do we have here?
So this is these are actually slides of brains of individuals with dyslexia, children with dyslexia. So if I can get up.
Yes.
Okay. So this brain here is children that can read, that typically read, and so you see these areas of the brain are lighting up, meaning that they're being activated, they're being used.
Okay.
And then these are children with dyslexia before they had remediation or extra teaching, and you see like these parts of the brain, compared to the children who can read, these areas of the brain of children with dyslexia are not. It's like they're asleep. It's like they're not activating in the same way.
Okay.
And then this is the same children after they had remediation. So they had intensive teaching on reading, and you see then that they were able to, with intense instruction, these areas of the brain were able to awaken, so to speak. So they were able to function with help.
Okay, so why do you have dyslexia? How does that have to do with what we're talking about?
It's just that this is research. Dyslexia is in some ways easier to study if you're looking at brains, so that you can teach someone to better read in a short period of time. So this was about 30 days of instruction, about 100 minutes a day. So it's again very intense, but you were able to, over the course of a couple months, show that there was improvement in these areas of the brain. So,
Okay.
so the idea, so why I included this is because this shows that the brain can be remediated.
Okay.
That there are things that one can do to improve the functioning of the brain.
All right.
So again, just to summarize, adolescent minds are qualitatively different than adults. Adolescent brains are still developing. Adolescents, even older adolescents, are more likely than adults to engage in risky and impulsive behavior. Adolescents are more emotionally reactive and susceptible to peer influences. They have limited problem-solving skills and less capacity to weigh the consequences of their actions. Punishing adolescents as adults does not appear to act as a deterrent.
Okay.
Where do we draw the line? Science doesn't tell us exactly where to draw the line, but on average, brains typically complete development in the mid-20s. Sentencing should be at least compatible with scientific evidence. Sentencing should reflect the consequences and costs of erroneously severe
don't know how to, I'm just gonna leave that up there. So that completes your PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
So where we're looking at juveniles differently, we're looking, and that's based upon what you've just talked about, the growing science and studies and actual knowledge of the development of the adolescent brain and its less functioning as an adult and the less development. So when you evaluated Mr. Gaeta, did you see, you've already testified that you have a diagnosis of severe depression, correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And when you interacted with him, his presentation to you was slow and minimal, is that correct?
Yeah, he was talking slow, he seemed to be thinking slow, he seemed confused, he didn't talk much, he was not very spontaneous, he tended to use short phrases, he had difficulty remembering things that had happened.
Okay. And you didn't get the feeling that he was purposefully trying not to engage with you, is that correct?
I did not have that feeling.
Okay.
I should add that as the interview continued, he did become a little more spontaneous, a little more, he showed more emotion as the interview, a little more emotion as the interview continued. He seemed a little more relaxed as the interview continued.
And you had reviewed prior records from Western State Hospital, and in those records, those same appearances were noted, correct?
Yes, he presented similarly, more severely depressed actually when he was at Western State Hospital.
All right. Now, when you evaluated Mr. Gaeta, you looked at different aspects of his life, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And could you tell me about that?
Sure. Okay. At the time of the offense, he was living with his mother and stepfather in Bremerton. He reported his mother was a registered nurse at Harrison Medical Center, and his stepfather is a medical technologist. He's the youngest of his mother's 6 children, 5 of whom have the same father as Gabe. He described a positive relationship with his mother and feeling supported by her. His stepfather has been in his life since Gabe was 3 years old, and he and his family moved in with his stepfather around his 4th birthday. Gabe reported a good relationship with his stepfather, and that his stepfather always treated him well. He reported he only remembered seeing his father a few times in his life, and they would speak on the phone occasionally when he was growing up. He also described a good relationship with his sister, who was 25 years old at the time of our interview, and she was visiting him about once a month. His other siblings were living out of state. He also reported, and mental health records also documented this, that he and his next older brother had a conflict a few months prior to the referral offense, contributing to the severe depressive episode Gabe was suffering up to and following the referral offense.
Okay. So, prior to this referral offense, you learned of Mr. Gaeta suffering from a severe depressive episode, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And what do you, that episode, what did you learn how his behavior was?
Well, I understood that after he wasn't allowed to go on a band trip, that he became severely depressed.
Uh-huh.
So he withdrew socially, he stopped attending school, he stayed at home. He mostly stayed in his bedroom. He would leave his bedroom to go to the bathroom, and then he would eat by himself at night.
So he was non-communicative during that time?
Yes, I'm told that he was poorly communicative with his mother.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there were concerns from his family members at that time, correct?
Yeah, his mother tried to find help for him, but he lacked awareness of the need for help. She called the school and asked for help, but she was told they couldn't help. She called the county designated mental health professional about involuntary treatment, was told that he would need to be taken to the emergency room. He eventually agreed to an outpatient appointment, but then he refused to follow up after that. And then he agreed to visit his primary care doctor, his family doctor, to be started on antidepressant, and so that did happen.
So his refusal to follow up, that's an example of the adolescent mind not working, working correctly.
I think a combination of the adolescent mind and the severely depressed mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so, what other information did you gather? Did you look at when you were evaluating Mr. Gaeta?
Well, we looked at his early childhood history. So his mother developed asthma when she was pregnant with Gabe, and she began using inhalers. She reported significant stress while raising 5 children and attending nursing school while pregnant. He was born full term. His mother used an epidural anesthetic during labor. And she found that experience unusual, using the epidural. He was born healthy, and they were discharged from the hospital together. She said he didn't cry much and was fussy at times, but was easy to control or console. She said he was always anxious and cautious around strangers. He was shy and non-assertive around most people. He was not a talkative baby. Let's see, when he was 2 years old, his mother fled Gabe's abusive biological father. At that point, he was sent from Indiana, where they were living at the time, to live with his maternal aunt and maternal grandparents in Alaska, while his mother and his siblings moved from Indiana to Washington State and the Kitsap Peninsula.
Okay. And did you consider that having an effect on his childhood?
Yeah, very clearly, their attachment, their bond was disrupted.
Okay.
And so that would have, you would assume negative effects due to the disrupted attachment.
Okay. All right.
So he reunified with his mother and siblings several months later. And then other things happened prior to Gabe's birth. Gabe's half-sister accused Gabe's biological father of sexually abusing her. Gabe's mother sought and was granted a temporary court order in Alaska against Gabe's father, having contact with Gabe's half-sister, siblings, and herself.
Okay. Well, why is this significant if it happened prior to Gabe's birth?
Well, it speaks to just the level of chaos that was going on in the family.
Okay.
Also, other types of victimization that were going on
Okay.
in the family.
Okay.
So
it
you
goes.
have domestic violence, you have sexual abuse going on.
Okay. And so, in your evaluation, you saw that there was Mr. Gaeta grew up in a chaotic household.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, his family was reported to Child Protective Services in 3 different states.
Okay. All right. And also with domestic violence, correct?
Yes, and also domestic violence.
Okay.
And then, as far as Gabe's own upbringing, Gabe's oldest brother, who was 11 years older, physically and psychologically abused Gabe. Gabe reported that his oldest brother would hit and throw him around. He also remembered being afraid of his brother. He remembered being terrorized when he was young. His older brother would put him up in high places, like a tree or a fence, and tell him that there were, like something bad would happen to him, like there were animals or bad things would happen to him if he touched the ground. He said that his brother's abuse ended when the oldest brother moved out of the home.
Okay.
And it's also my understanding that his oldest brother was physically and psychologically abusive to the other siblings as well.
Okay.
And again, Gabe was exposed to domestic violence when he was younger.
So we have Gabe being born into a family that already has chaos, domestic violence, experienced further chaos, further domestic violence amongst other members of the family as well as directed towards him, correct?
Yes.
So he witnessed it as well as experienced it?
Yes.
And that's significant because that goes towards the formation, his childhood development, correct?
Yes. Yes. So these are factors that are often predict negative behaviors, negative outcomes, negative school outcomes, substance use.
Okay.
breaking the law, things like that.
Okay. All right. So what else of significance did you note when you were evaluating Mr. Gaeta?
Well, as we've briefly discussed before, at the time of the referral offense, Gabe was preparing for the start of the school year, but he hadn't completed the 11th grade because he stopped attending school during spring of his junior year. His mother reported that this was a source of stress to him because he had not yet selected a school program, and he seemed to be avoidant of trying to decide what he was going to do for school. So they were looking at things like alternative schools and online schools, but no decision had been made. I also learned that Gabe earned his GED, his general equivalency diploma, while he was detained at Kitsap County Juvenile Detention. There's also family psychiatric history. So Gabe's mother reported that she herself suffers from depression, for which she's taken medication. She also reported postpartum depression after his birth, which also might have affected her bonding and attachment with Gabe. His mother reported that her deceased sister suffered from depression, and she also believes that another one of Gabe's aunts suffered bipolar disorder. Gabe reported that his half-sister suffers from bipolar disorder and takes medication, and his oldest brother was diagnosed and treated for ADHD. Records also indicated Gabe's other sister suffers from depression. And so why this is important is because there seems to be a genetic predisposition towards depression and mood disorders in his family.
In his family,
Yeah.
okay.
And that sets him up genetically as well as socially. So he was genetically at risk, and then the events of his early childhood also would have put him at risk for depression.
Okay. All right.
As far as mental health treatment then, he first sought help for depression from Dr. Huang at the Front Street Clinic in Paulsbo. He said, according to Gabe and all records, this was his first contact with mental health services. So Dr. Huang conducted an initial intake with Gabe and his stepfather in May of 2014 and communicated with Gabe's mother after the appointment. So Dr. Huang diagnosed Gabe with major depressive disorder, and Gabe reported symptoms of depressed mood, sadness, disordered sleep, difficulty when trying to fall asleep, social withdrawal, and a decrease in engaging in pleasurable activities. He reported that he was lying in bed, not attending school, and doing nothing. Dr. Huang's records indicated that Gabe and his stepfather reported that Gabe previously experienced depressive episodes, but he didn't receive help for those previous episodes. At the follow-up appointment, Gabe and his mother drove to Dr. Huang's office, but Gabe refused to get out of the car, saying that the session was torture. And so later, Gabe clarified that the torture was just, what he meant by that was it was very painful to talk about past events or hurtful previous events.
Okay.
And so he actually only saw Dr. Huang once. During our interview, Gabe said he was confused around the time he saw Dr. Huang. He said he saw him because he believed his mother wanted him to, because she was concerned that he was depressed.
So he didn't have any insight himself into his need to see Dr. Huang?
That's what that was what was indicated, and that's also consistent with the history. They didn't follow up with Dr. Huang. He didn't ask to see Dr. Huang or see anyone for help to begin with. It was his mother that scheduled the appointment and really encouraged him to attend.
Okay.
As far as medication history prior to being detained, so he stopped seeing Dr. Huang, and then in June, he saw his primary care doctor, Dr. Trong, who prescribed an antidepressant, escitalopram, the name is Lexapro, 10 milligrams a day for depression. And according to Dr. Trong's records, Gabe's mother was worried that he'd been depressed for the previous 3 months. He'd become withdrawn, socially isolated, staying in his bedroom, and not attending school. Dr. Trong's records indicated that Gabe reported feeling depressed, tired, hopeless, and worthless. He also reported a loss of interest in friends and family and low self-esteem. Dr. Trong described Gabe's affect or his mood as being flat and abnormal. So he also diagnosed Gabe with depression. He prescribed the medication escitalopram, 10 milligrams a day. So when he saw Dr. Trong the next month, Gabe reported feeling much better since starting the medication, reported improved mood and spending more time with family and friends. His mother reported that he seemed happier. And at the time that he was detained, then he was still taking the escitalopram 10 milligrams
Okay, so he had just begun taking that medication, correct?
in June.
Okay, a few months prior, okay. All right, and it was showing some effects?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he seemed to be responding. He seemed happier. He was coming out of his room and
Alright.
talking to more people. But he still, by his mother's report, seemed not quite himself. He seemed anxious,
Uh-huh.
pacing around the house nervously, still not initiating a lot of actions, really having to be encouraged to go out and do things.
Okay, all right, okay. And then you also looked at mental health issues while he was in custody, correct?
Yeah.
He displayed symptoms of of a severe episode of depression, correct?
Yeah, so when he was in juvenile detention, Kitsap County Juvenile Detention, he filled out a screen, and on the screen he endorsed symptoms of feeling depressed or sad, problems paying attention and concentrating, a history of being hit in the head and knocked unconscious, taking medications for depression, and believing that the medication helped. He denied feeling suicidal, homicidal. When he was detained then in juvenile detention, the medication that he was taking was maintained, was continued for a while, and then at some point it was stopped. And it's not clear from the records why the medication was stopped. It seemed like the doctor in juvenile detention tried to get help, like a consultation from a psychiatrist, but he had difficulty obtaining that. Again, it's not clear, but for whatever reason, the medication was stopped. And then a couple months later, in October of 2014, the detention staff sent Gabe to Harrison Medical Center after he refused to eat or interact with detention staff that day. He was not following directions, and he was real flat in his mood. The doctor at the emergency department diagnosed Gabe with depression and cleared him to return to detention, cleared him medically to return. And then he was transferred to Kitsap County Jail when he was 18. In May of 2015, he was prescribed olanzapine, which is an antipsychotic medication for possible bipolar disorder. So again, suggesting that they were concerned about his mental health. A psychiatric nurse practitioner suggested a trial of an antidepressant for depression, but that was in October of 2015. But Gabe wasn't interested in an antidepressant, and he wanted to continue the medication he was already taking. Gabe reported that the medication, the antipsychotic, olanzapine, was stopped because of hypertension, but other records indicated that the medication was stopped because Gabe didn't want to take it. In May of 2016, Gabe was reported to be unresponsive or poorly responsive and uncooperative with the detention and mental health staff. An electroshock device was used on Gabe in order to remove him from the cell for evaluation. Records indicated that Gabe didn't appear to have showered recently and interacted minimally.
So this is another episode of his depression,
Yes.
correct?
Yes. He appeared depressed, with flat affect. He was sent to Harrison Medical Center in May 2016 after not eating or drinking for 3 days. The detention mental health staff met with Gabe intermittently to discuss stress management and healthy coping skills. In September 2016, he intentionally hit his head over frustration that other inmates were taking his property. In October 2016, Gabe requested a solitary cell in order to have some time alone. His mother suspected that Gabe was requesting solitary confinement because he was feeling threatened. On the day he made his request, staff noted that there was an increase in his pausing before speaking and confused thinking. In the weeks to follow, the staff described him as being more withdrawn, more depressed, and socially isolated. In November of 2016, he refused to meet with his defense attorneys. His family reported he was less engaged with them. In December 2016, he became more socially isolated and poorly responsive. he stopped communicating with his family and refused hypertension care.
Okay, so the significance of all of that is we're showing how Gabe is dealing with a significant mental health issue, correct?
Yes,
And
yes,
that-
he's severely depressed and
Okay.
again becoming more withdrawn.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then you looked at records where he went to Western State Hospital and he was still in the midst of a severe mental health depression, correct?
Yes,
But then he was medicated at Western State Hospital?
yes.
Okay.
So Western State actually sought and were granted a court order for involuntary medication. So he was not agreeing to take medication.
So
at that
this
time.
is, at that time, so we have the youth, just the biological issue related to the underdeveloped brain, as well as adding to it a severe depressive episode. So Gabe is not making good decisions at all at this particular time, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Right.
all right. So they were able to eventually medicate him though?
Yes, they got a court order and then were able to medicate him.
And then after he was medicated, was there a significant improvement or an improvement in his behavior?
There was an improvement in his thinking and behavior such that eventually he was,
Go ahead, Fred.
Sorry.
yeah, so he improved to the point where he was felt to be able to assist in his own defense.
Okay, all right. All right. And so then you, after Western State Hospital, then that's when you see Gabe, correct?
Yeah, well, I saw him, let's see, November of last year.
Okay.
He was released,
Okay.
around a few months before that from
Okay.
Western State.
All right, all right. And so, let's see. And you see Gabe, and you are able to come to an expert opinion, a diagnosis, correct, with
Yes.
Gabe, after reviewing all of this information and consulting with Gabe yourself, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And, yes, I diagnosed him with major depressive disorder, recurrent, severe.
Major
Major
Depressive.
depressive disorder, recurrent, meaning he's had prior episodes of depression,
Okay.
and severe.
And that it's severe. Okay. And that's affected him. So, you testified that Gabe has experienced adverse childhood situations, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you've testified that that you've diagnosed him with a major depressive disorder.
yes.
Are there any other factors that you saw or that you concluded to when you evaluated Gabe that you saw affected his ability to make decisions or his outcome, his choices?
Well, he hit his head a few times, was diagnosed with a concussion back in
Okay.
2011, or I'm sorry, 2013,
Okay.
during a wrestling match. He also hit his head a few times and was seen in the emergency room in 2011. And in 1999, when he was 2 years old, his head hit a cement block. He received medication or medical attention for this episode as well.
Okay. So he has a biological predisposition to mental health issues. He has a mental health issue. He's had adverse childhood experiences. He's had concussions and head trauma, correct?
Yes.
And head trauma can affect a person's behavior, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Could you talk to me about the potential for Mr. Gaeta to be rehabilitated with his, to receive treatment with all of these factors that you talked about? Are there positives here?
Yeah, well, there are a number of positives and strengths. As I said, a lot of individuals who have had his early childhood experiences actually would have been involved with the juvenile justice system, substance use, would have had problems attending school, and he didn't, until this event, until the offense, he had no prior contact with the law. So that does suggest that there are a number of strengths in the system. He has a very supportive family, so that family involvement and parental warmth can protect youth from adverse childhood experiences. After the chaos of his early childhood, Gabe's mother made a number of changes in her life, including escaping an abusive relationship, ending CPS involvement by meeting conditions set forth by the dependency court, completing nursing school, and maintaining steady employment. His mother also tried to advocate for him when his depression became severe. In the face of these serious charges, his family remained supportive, and his mother, stepfather, and sister visit him regularly.
Okay.
So having a strong support system will assist rehabilitation.
Okay.
Gabe was also involved in pro-social activities, so that pro-social activities can also protect against antisocial behavior. So Gabe participated in wrestling, football, and band. And this kept him positively occupied in constructive activities and associating with positive peers. These activities support good physical and emotional health and prevented negative behaviors such as substance abuse, which was never a problem for Gabe.
Okay.
These interests will support rehabilitation by providing positive behaviors and displacing time that can be spent on negative behaviors. So he already has ways of having fun that don't involve like breaking the law or using drugs or things like that.
Okay.
He also had pro-social peers, and so socializing with pro-social peers encourages pro-social behavior and thinking, and discourages socializing with antisocial peers. So he had a good friend group through sports and band. He met his close friends through athletics, and they would work out and attend sports camps and play sports together. And his parents also met the parents of his friends, and that's also protective, like knowing if the parents know the parents of your friends, that can help.
Okay. So he has a variety of factors that are positive towards his ability, his coping ability, and his rehabilitation, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What else?
As far as other factors, Gabe, at the time that I saw him, was involved with mental health treatment at the time of our interview, but his engagement with services and insight were limited. So the fact that he didn't have much therapy prior to his offense suggests that he has great potential to benefit from therapy. So after he's sentenced, he will require a rehabilitation program that addresses his emotional and behavioral needs and additional needs related to depression. So he should be educated as to depression in general, as well as his specific symptoms and manifestations of depression. In his case, depression can be very severe. It's also associated with confusion, slow thinking, poor decision making, and social withdrawal. It should also be emphasized that although he can suffer from severe depression, his symptoms respond to medication. So the importance of working with treatment providers and social supports to treat depression should be emphasized, along with the potential of medications to reduce depression. He should also participate in skills training to further develop self-awareness of internal states, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, social and problem-solving skills. He should also maintain pro-social relationships with family and friends, and further develop pro-social relationships.
Okay. So,
Ms. LaCrosse, can I just check with you in terms
I'm
of-
almost done. I'm like, pretty much my last question here, just let the,
Okay.
I probably already asked it, but, so there is, in your opinion, a high potential for Gabe to be rehabilitated and to be able to learn coping mechanisms and skills to deal with his severe depressive episodes, and also as just he grows older, his brain, he's going to be able to have more self-awareness and more insight into the, his mental health status, correct?
Yes, yes. Yes, I believe he has great potential to learn about his depression as well as to just change, affect the kind of person that he'll be
Okay.
when he grows up.
Okay, all right. And that, in conjunction with that, he has a positive support structure that will have an impact on that as well, correct?
Yes, his family remains involved and supportive.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Do you have many questions?
Not many, but a few.
Well, I'm just thinking it might be a good time to just take a short break. Staff's been in here since 9 o'clock, and I don't know if the jail might need a break as well. So I think it probably makes sense, basically, as soon as we can get Mr. Gaeta back so we can continue, so whatever you need in terms of taking a break, to get him down and back, and then we'll get going. So I plan to be ready as soon as that can happen. So obviously, as lacrosse, if you need to take a break so that we can bring him back in, that'd be great. Okay, so we'll take a short recess and we'll resume shortly.
All rise.
think also like just how one is behaving, so like how one conducts oneself, and that's important when we have records from detention and jail.
And that was post-incident?
Yes.
Okay, when he knew that he had been charged with murder in the first degree and rape of a child in the first degree, correct?
Yes.
And knew that he was facing a very lengthy sentence?
Yes.
You're familiar with the Miller case?
Yes.
And the defendant in that particular case was 14 years of age, yes?
Yes.
Right, and Mr. Gaeta was just shy of 18, maybe 4 months, 3 months.
Yes, he was 17.
Now, isn't it true that most juveniles who have the symptoms and the conditions that Mr. Gaeta had don't commit crimes like rape of a child and murder in first grade, right?
Yes.
Especially folks who are either getting treatment or who are medicated, correct?
The crime was a rare event in any situation. He wasn't getting a lot of treatment at the time.
You talked earlier, and you used a slide that was kind of interesting to me, frankly, about the rental car.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that for just a second. So rental car agencies don't let folks who are under 25 years old rent a car because they can't make as good of decisions in terms of the responsibility of having a car that doesn't belong to you, and because it's expensive, right?
Yeah,
They're more
I think they've
impulsive.
worked out you're asking, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So
Sorry.
kids are more impulsive, people under 25 are more impulsive, they don't appreciate, the gravity of a responsibility like that as much as somebody over 25 would, correct?
Yes, yes.
But wouldn't you agree that there are some things that people who are juveniles, even as young as Mr. Gaeta or younger, know that you just shouldn't do? For instance, rape a child and murder a child, right? Like, you can't really compare the decision-making process that goes into renting a car and being responsible for that. You can't compare that to the decision-making process about violating a human in the same way, can you?
I wouldn't compare the two behaviors, but I think the brain science the same brain science would apply, that until one is in one's mid-20s on average, one's decision-making capabilities are not fully developed.
So you don't think that there's anything in the literature to support that the decision that's being made is part of the issue, whether or not a person is capable of making that decision?
Well, I had some other slides also showing that adolescents don't differentiate between hard questions and easy questions. So that, again, that's part of the decision-making process that I'm referring to. But again, I don't mean to compare the two behaviors that you're talking about. I would say that they're very different.
Well, let's use a different example then. Wouldn't you agree that a 2-year-old, for instance, might not be able to use an open flame to light a birthday candle? They wouldn't be able to appreciate what they're doing there and the danger. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, but a 5-year-old might sort of get that, right? You probably still wouldn't trust a 5-year-old with an open flame with a birthday candle, would you?
I wouldn't.
Okay, but a 17-year-old, nearly 18-year-old should be able to appreciate the consequences of what they're doing, the danger potentially of what they're doing, the type of ripple effect it could have on others if they mistreat that open flame. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Compared to a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old, yes. But again, the slides I showed also indicate that a 17-year-old is still pretty impulsive. They may not think through the consequences of their actions, including what could happen with an open flame.
Sure.
In the same ways as someone in their 30s would.
But rape and murder is different than lighting a birthday candle in so many ways. For instance, there's nothing that's good or wholesome or normal about those activities such that you would have to make that decision-making process. You would just ultimately know that's the wrong thing to do, right?
Again, there are other attorneys in the room, but my understanding is that the Miller decision actually does look at something like murder and talks about it, the punishment being different for adults than adolescents.
And it is different, but I'm talking about the choices to be made. people ultimately know there's just some things that whether or not you're just shy of 18 or whether you're 26, that you know you ought not to do. And probably murder and rape are two of those things, right?
I think, yes, those are things that one should not do.
And in terms of decision making and his ability to think through his crime, he didn't pick an adult to do these things to, did he? He picked a young child, somebody completely vulnerable. Isn't that true?
Yes.
So if he had an impulse to do these behaviors, he went about it in a fairly decision smart way, because he was able to commit his crime. It would have been a lot different had it been an adult as his victim as a child. Wouldn't you say that's true and show some decision making?
Again, it's very hard to understand why he did what he did.
And in all the things that you reviewed, and in your discussions with him yourself, did you ever ask him about his decision-making process, ever once?
His decision-making
Process.
I'm sorry, can you clarify that?
Sure. Did you ever ask Mr. Gaeta what went into his thought process of why he did these things?
I did not.
Wouldn't that have been information that he could have relied upon?
My understanding is that he had no explanation for what happened.
But you didn't ask him yourself.
No, I didn't.
You talked about rehabilitation and how it was a positive for you that he had never done other activities such as shoplift or, whatever, minor crimes, right?
Yes.
And that was a positive to you.
Yes, that there's not a pattern of antisocial behavior or law-breaking behavior.
But doesn't it concern you in terms of rehabilitation that he went from A to Z, no criminal activity, to probably the worst crime you can do to a person, rape and murder?
I think anytime one's trying to rehabilitate someone that's committed rape and murder, it's a very worrisome. These are worrisome behaviors. These are crimes. I think, given that one, given a choice of having a record of law-breaking behavior and no law-breaking behavior, I would say the person with no law-breaking behavior would be more amenable to rehabilitation.
More amenable to rehabilitation?
Yes.
And so are you considering the fact that the crime that he did commit was such a serious violent offense? Does that impact his ability to be rehabilitated, the type of crime he committed?
Yes.
But you didn't speak about that earlier, and that wasn't in your report necessarily.
I didn't speak about what.
Well, you're saying that because he had no criminal history before, that is a positive for you and believing that he can be rehabilitated. But here, you're actually saying that, in fact, yeah, the violent nature of this offense could actually work against rehabilitation.
I was talking about someone who had committed crimes, like had a prior record, versus someone with no prior record.
So to you, the type of crime that he committed without having any prior criminal history at all, he didn't build up to this, he just did it. That's not concerning for you in terms of rehabilitation.
Oh, it is a factor in rehabilitation, yes.
And that wasn't in your report, though.
I didn't discuss that.
I have nothing further, thank you.
Ms. LaCrosse, any other questions?
Dr. Lee, it's still your opinion, however, that you feel that Gabriel will have an opportunity at rehabilitation, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that the opportunities that are presented to him for rehabilitation will have a positive effect on Mr. Gaeta. Correct.
What one would expect that he could respond to.
Other issues on sentencing?
I have, Gabe's mother would like to speak to the court, not necessarily testify.
Sure.
She just has a letter that she wants to read, Your Honor.
Sure. I can have her come forward. I'll have you state your name for the record, and if you're going to read, just don't read too fast, please.
My name is Tina Wright. Your Honor, it has been a confusing and heart-wrenching time for my family. We grieve for two, but advocate for one. I wrote this for my family and friends of Gabe in an attempt to prevent myself from rambling. I wrote down, with tears on my cheeks. I wrote down words with a grim sense of shame and a mother's heartache for her son, knowing that with every step Janice took, her family could feel her feet treading upon their own heart.
I can't.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's hard to understand you when Ms. LaCrosse might be.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did you? Hey, I don't have to repeat myself, do I? Okay. Ron Powers, the author of No One Cares About Crazy People, wrote, "Sometimes my feelings are so hot that I have to take a pen and pour them out on paper to keep them from setting me afire inside. Then all that ink and labor wasted because I can't print the result. Gabe's siblings love him. Steve and I, my husband, love him. He has family in Pennsylvania, Florida, Indiana, and Alaska who love him. They, along with his friends, have expressed a common theme over and over. He is loyal. He is quiet around people he doesn't know. He is slow to trust his thoughts and feelings with anyone. He advocated for bullied children and abused animals. Once he was comfortable with you, he would joke around and tease. Zanetta, his oldest sister, observed he showed patience and tolerance for rambunctious behavior around him. He was always a calm stillness, letting his nephews, Teo and niece Vicky, use his body as a jungle gym, and he would sit there calmly smiling. He was a safe harbor then for them. Gabe's teachers, caregivers, and coaches all have told me that Gabe would mentor those younger or smaller than himself with a gentle hand. God, I can't get it. However, he was not as kind or gentle mentoring or dealing with those he felt wronged, who he felt wronged him, or the people he loved. I quote Ezekiel, one of his brothers. When Gabe was about 3, I remember picking on him. I quote him. He said, "I was an asshole to him, and he picked up a wooden spoon that fell on the kitchen floor, and he hit me with it." This was very apparent when I watched him wrestle someone bigger and more experienced and more aggressive with him. Gabe has proven over and over that he is coachable, can learn and adapt. My son is redeemable. Ivan, yet another brother, used to take Gabe and Zeke with him to wrestling practice. He learned how to wrestle from the older junior high children. Later, when it was his turn to wrestle in matches, my husband and I were impressed with how he would look at the coaches for guidance and follow it when the other wrestlers ignored their coaches. Zeke, his brother, once again, was one of these and repeated his mistakes over and over while Gabe improved. Zeke said that it was only when he's... Did I say Gabe? Okay. Said that it was only when he started observing Gabe carefully manage himself on the mat that he was able to change his habits. I was in awe of his never quit, never die attitude then. Gabe has a scientific mind. He experiments. If one way doesn't work, he will try another. He can formulate a hypothesis and monitor its results and come to an accurate conclusions. Steve, my husband, and Gabe would work on science projects for school. He impressed me with how he would ask for help and how much time he alone put into projects. Of course, I was comparing him to his siblings, who would slap a project together and call it good. Gabe rarely complained. When he did, I knew I needed to pay attention, whether it was an injury or how he felt a friend or a family member was treated poorly by others. He would try to fix it for his friends. When it came to his own injuries, we often didn't really know how bad he was injured until his blood pressure was beyond acceptable or he was walking awkwardly. This brings me back to Gabe's love for animals. One of Gabe's friends told me to be sure to tell Gabe about dog training programs in prison. She witnessed how he handled her dogs and how they trusted him unconditionally. She sent me pictures of how trusting. I witnessed a cat following Gabe home before all this happened. It sat outside the door until it had a chance to zip inside. The Siamese cat was so ridiculously funny and intuitive. He went straight to Gabe's room. I would put him outside and he would find his way back in. I would often find him stretched out along his back with his tummy upward, right next to Gabe. This cat knew Gabe was in trouble then, and so did we. Later, much later, we found out where he actually belonged and tried to encourage him to go home. I wonder what happened to that cat. Sinetta's first memories of Gabe as a baby spinning up on her when she fed him and cuddling with him at night when I worked night shift. She remembers island lakes, soggy, sandy diapers, minnows, and upside-down stands and curiosity about living things. His brother Marcus remained silent through all of this except to text me and say that Leo, his nephew, and he love him. Ivan remembers Gabe with a diapered toddler walk, running and stumbling into him and grabbing his legs after baseball practice. He knows Gabe's takes. A while to warm up to people, and his fond memories of Gabe spent with him in Iowa, swimming, wrestling, staying up late, watching movies, and the lazy lemonade drinking while they watched fireflies from the porch, and laying back in the hammocks with no cares in the world. He said he was so proud to see him become a fearless, full of life, and into a man breaking out of his quiet shell. Zeke said Gabe would open up with him and talk when they were playing catch or sports. He admires, and at times in awe, at how poetic Gabe could be about things he cared about. Zeke also emphasized that he saw how cats and dogs were attracted to Gabe. Zara remembers talking to Gabe before he was born and responding to her by moving in my tummy. She remembers very clearly the first time Gabe took our black Labrador for a walk. At about 2 years old or so, he had managed to put on his rubber boots, hook up baby to a leash, and take off on a walk with the dog outside of our yard unnoticed by anybody. She said she found him sitting, swinging his legs and eating chocolate with the friendly adults, and a police officer brought them home. This was all true, and it could have turned out so badly. The point of this statement is that Gabe is a good person who did a very, very bad thing. We know that the results of his actions have no chance of changing anything for Janice's family. She is forever gone, and we are wholeheartedly sorry for that. Gabe is a person who can learn, grow, and believe, and become a productive member of society.
I'm going to hand forward a statement from Gabe.
Do you need 2 copies?
Did the state get a copy of the?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. And Ms. LaCrosse, did you want it read out loud, or what's your, I guess, how are you asking the court to handle it?
Well, Your Honor, my client is not able to speak, and we want that in the court file for Your Honor to be aware of and to know that. So, if you would like, I could read that into the record.
It probably should be read out loud for the benefit of others who are here.
Your Honor, I am remorseful. I feel bad about what I did. It was a very bad thing to do. I took a young girl's life away from her and from her family and friends. I feel like that should never happen to anybody, and no one should ever have to experience that. I can't put into words how bad I feel about this. I wish I could make amends for this. I don't know why I did it. Gabriel, Gaeta.
Ms. Lacrosse, anything on sentencing in terms of the Appendix F or anything else that you want the court to know? And I understand that from what you're saying is that Mr. Gaeta does not wish to address the court specifically. He does have the right to do so, and so I need to at least officially give him the
Yes, he
opportunity.
has the right to do so. He understands that. And Your Honor, Mr. Gaeta is not capable of being able to speak here at the sentencing. So it's not that he wanted to express to the best that he could what his thoughts are. And so we took time and we wrote that down. And we spent quite a bit of time with him, but yeah, he's not able to speak here.
So, Mr. Gaeta, you do have the right to speak at sentencing, and so if you change your mind at this moment is your opportunity. If there's anything that you would like the court to know that you haven't expressed in this written statement, I'm just officially giving you an opportunity. I'm not saying you have to do it, but I'm giving you an opportunity at this time to do so. And anything else, Ms. Lacrosse?
Your Honor, we just asked, I don't have any more evidence or any more testimony to present. We ask that you follow the recommendation that we have come before the court with on this matter. Apologize for the significant lengths that this case took. Mr. Gaeta never intended or wanted to take this matter to trial at all. The lengths that for a resolution, Mr. Gaeta dealt with some serious mental health issues while in custody. We had reviewing discovery, took a considerable amount of time. I would bring that up to Mr. Gaeta, and he would have a breakdown, and which coincided with how Dr. Lee testified about the issues that he had while he was in custody. And so it's taken Mr. Gaeta a significant amount of time to be able to come to terms with the fact of what did occur and what he did do. So he is diagnosed with a severe severe depression than I've ever seen before. Communicating with Mr. Gaeta has been extremely difficult, and never once did I get the sense that Mr. Gaeta was trying to be obstructive or not trying to communicate. I've never seen this level of depression at all before, and he has the ability to be able to participate into rehabilitation. He has the ability to learn self-awareness and insight into his mental health issue. I don't even know if we've discovered all of the mental health issues that Mr. Gaeta has or the depths of that. But what we do know is that there is treatment for that, and there is, as he grows from a teenager into a young man into an older adult, he is going to be able to change his character and change his behavior and change who he is. And so he wanted to be able to resolve this case. Or in no means at all did he ever want this matter to go to trial. And we were able to work out an agreement with the the state, and we ask that the court follow that.
Anything further from the state?
Only if you want the state to address Miller factors in any other way other than what's outlined in our brief.
I don't think so, I agree. So I'm just gonna take a few minutes, I'm gonna step down. I have actually drafted out most of what I have to say, but in light of everything that's happened, I wanna make sure I've covered everything. So if everybody can just give me a few minutes just to double check that, and I'll be prepared to come out and do this final sentencing. This will just take a couple minutes, okay? Thank you.
All rise. All rise. Court is now in session.
Please be seated. Can everybody hear me okay? So today we are here to sentence Gabriel Gaeta to the rape and murder of 6-year-old Janice Wright. This day brings to a close the legal proceedings that have impacted the victim's family and the community for nearly 4 years. As I begin my comments, I'm well aware there is nothing that I will be able to say today that will alleviate the level of tragedy that this particular case presents. Before fairly recent developments in the law, sentencing hearings for crimes such as this were primarily focused on the offenses, the impacts on victims' families, and not particularly on the maturity level of the defendant. The law now requires the court to consider what we have called and referred to today as the Miller factors when the court issues a sentence for Mr. Gaeta, because it is now well understood that juvenile offenders are different than adult offenders. As a judge, I've seen the truth of this. As a juvenile court judge, I've seen the impacts of youthful offenders. I've seen how it impacts crimes that are presented before the court. And under the law, the court is mandated and obligated to consider the maturity of the defendant to ensure that any sentence that the court imposes does not violate the Eighth Amendment, and which would, in this case, benefit no one, as that would simply result in the case or sentence being overturned and returned back to this court. However, the youth of Mr. Gaeta provides no consolation to the family of Janice, and I can imagine that having a hearing that's been focused on the youth and immaturity of the defendant is particularly painful to a family that lost a 6-year-old child in such a brutal way. Be assured that while I am going to focus on Mr. Gaeta's maturity, which is my obligation to do, the loss of Janice's life will continue to be in the forefront of my mind. As the parties are aware, and as the people in the courtroom I'm sure are aware, on February 16, 2018, the defendant pled guilty to 2 offenses. First is the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree with a sexual motivation in a particularly vulnerable victim, the aggravator in this case being that the murder was committed to conceal a crime. The defendant also pled guilty to the crime of rape of a child in the first degree, also with the aggravator of a particularly vulnerable victim. The recommendation that's been made to the court by both the state and the defendant in this case is that the court set a minimum sentence of 40 years for count 1, and that a maximum sentence of 123 months be imposed on count 3 to run concurrent as an exceptional sentence. Whatever sentence this court imposes, it will be a minimum sentence. As pointed out by Ms. LaCrosse in her briefing, Mr. Gaeta cannot be paroled by the Department of Corrections until after a minimum sentence has been served. The fact, however, that there is an agreed upon recommendation to the court does not remove the requirement that the court consider the Miller factors, and that's why we've had the hearing that we've had today, where we've had testimony discussing the defendant's maturity. So the question today before the court is whether, under the facts of this case, while taking into consideration the Miller factors, what sentence is appropriate. In Washington law, the legislature has essentially codified what the Miller factors are under RCW 1095-030, subsection 3, subsection B. The court is obligated in determining a sentence of this kind to consider the age of the defendant at the time of the commission of the crime, the defendant's childhood and life experience, the degree of responsibility that the defendant was capable of exercising, and the defendant's chances of being rehabilitated. Those are essentially the 4 things the court must consider in determining what the appropriate sentence is to be. The Miller factors are discussed quite extensively in Ms. LaCrosse briefing, and Ms. Montgomery, I don't think, disputed the recitation of the law and how the law applies to this factor, but the state also provided a sentencing memorandum to the court. There's certain facts that are undisputable in this case. The reality is that at the time of the commission of this crime, Mr. Gaeta was 17 years old. It was August. He turned 18 in December. So he's just a few months short of his 18th birthday. It is, I think, not disputed that Mr. Gaeta was a little less mature than is typical of a 17-year-old of otherwise his age. But I would note that Dr. Lee's report indicates that Mr. Gaeta was functioning well within adolescent levels. So in other words, the way I interpret that is that he was less mature than the average 17-year-old, but he wasn't abnormally immature. Mr. Gaeta's childhood and life experiences have been discussed briefly in this courtroom, and obviously were less than ideal. But they certainly weren't the most tragic life experiences that this court sees. The court understands that he experienced some domestic violence when he was a very young child, and also that he had suffered some personal physical abuse by one of his family members. While domestic violence and physical abuse of Mr. Gaeta are unfortunate, it's unclear to this court how these experiences impacted Mr. Gaeta in a way that led to the crimes that he committed against Janice. Other than what is obvious, that they appeared to contribute to some of his mental health issues, which I'm going to discuss here in a moment. But the conclusions that he had a chaotic childhood impacted what he did to Janice lacks a connection for this court, and I'm missing this link. And I think the reason, and I think we're all going to have the same feeling at the end of this hearing today, I think one of the reasons that this link is missing for me is that the ultimate question in this case is always going to be why. What was happening that day, why this happened, how it happened. I think we have the general idea of what occurred that day, but I don't think anybody in this room, with the exception of Mr. Gaeta, could ever tell the court as to why this happened. And without knowing the why, it becomes difficult to link some of these issues that were identified about Mr. Gaeta to the crime itself. Second factor the court is required to consider is the degree of responsibility. Dr. Lee concluded that Mr. Gaeta lacked the capacity to make sophisticated judgments, and I put this in quotes, as an adult would. That his immature decision-making skills left him vulnerable to poorly thought out and impulsive choices. Dr. Lee opined that this crime was out of character for Mr. Gaeta, and that his untreated mental illness likely played a role in the offense. Dr. Lee indicated that Mr. Gaeta suffers, and he testified to this today, from a major mental illness, and specifically he testified that he suffers from major depressive disorder severe. Dr. Lee does not, however, offer an opinion specifically as to how Mr. Gaeta's mental health issues contributed to this particular crime. These conclusions about his depression, poor decision-making, and impulsivity do not create an obvious connection as to why Mr. Gaeta made the decisions he did on the day that he raped and murdered Janice. The opinion from Dr. Lee asked the court to make some assumptions, but the mere fact of his lack of maturity and mental health does not explain his responsibility for the crime, and as I've said, I don't know whether this was an impulsive act or a planned out crime. We don't know why this happened or how it happened. And interestingly to me, and Ms. Montgomery, asked this on cross, there's a question for Dr. Lee is, did you ask him why? Did you ask him what was in his mind? Because all of this matters to what was in his mind at the time. How does his mental health issue play into what was done that day? It's not done in a vacuum, and the lack of an answer to that question creates some difficulty for the court to see how the two things are linked. Nonetheless, the court does understand that Mr. Gaeta's commission of this crime was, to a degree, impacted by the reality of his youth. It is undisputed, I think at this point, that the science is very clear that adolescent brains, youthful brains, do not function as adult brains do. A decision that a child would make might not be the same decision that that same person would make if their brain was fully developed. And I think that is pretty well understood now in science, and is why, again, we have these types of hearings. So it's very clear that at the time of this commission of this crime, Mr. Gaeta, who's 17 years old, did not have a fully developed brain. The next question for the court is whether or not Mr. Gaeta is capable of rehabilitation. The testimony today, as well as the materials throughout this court file, I think reflect very clearly that Mr. Gaeta does not have a very strong history of insight into his own mental health needs. And ultimately, rehabilitation is going to be in Mr. Gaeta's hands. As Dr. Lee opined that Mr. Gaeta is capable of rehabilitation if he's willing to engage in therapeutic services, and believing that if he does that and as he matures and as his brain continues to mature, that he'll hopefully be able to develop the emotional regulation and control that he needs over his depression and his mental health issues. There was never any discussion about sex offender treatment, but obviously that's something that would be important as well in this particular case. Dr. Lee didn't opine as to the efficacy of that, and there was no information presented to the court on the any diagnoses related to the sex offense. The court really has no information on that, but certainly that's a part of this sentencing that needs to be very clear, is that sex offender treatment, to the extent that it's available to Mr. Gaeta while in prison, is something that needs to be followed through on. Mr. Gaeta presents a very unusual person to this court. Mr. Gaeta had no prior history at all that the court is aware of even being confronted by law enforcement for any of his behavior. He's had no involvement in the criminal justice system, in the juvenile justice system. I don't even know that he ever had a truancy petition filed against him. I know there was some reference to maybe one being filed when he stopped going to school, but it was never clear to me that one was even ever filed. An at-risk youth petition was never filed against Mr. Gaeta. As far as this court's aware, there's never been a file opened on Mr. Gaeta in a court system other than possibly a dependency at some point in time when he was younger. And yet, he goes from having no criminal history whatsoever to committing probably some of the worst crimes that anybody could ever commit in our society. And so it becomes a difficult question as to whether or not he is capable of rehabilitation. I lack an understanding of what caused him to do what he did on that day. But it appears to the court that if Mr. Gaeta is willing to engage in therapeutic services that will be hopefully made available to him in the Department of Corrections, that the fact that he does have some pro-social skills at his disposal, has a connection to a family that would likely support him, that at some point he may be again able to reintegrate into our community. This is going to be completely up to Mr. Gaeta, and the reality is that he has a poor track record throughout this case of engaging. We had a cell hearing where Mr. Gaeta was refusing to take his medication, that the court had to compel forced medication, and I realized that he was in the throes of his depression at that time, and his decision-making skills were even further compromised as a result of that. But he's going to have to, and if there's nothing else, Mr. Gaeta, that you get from me today, is that for you to ever have any future again, you've got to be willing to engage in therapy and treatment made available to you. There is no choice. That is the only thing that you can do, and that's really the only thing you have control over, and you really need to take that opportunity that's given to you whenever available. Talking about the Miller factors can't be done in a vacuum. I think that it's important that we remember why we're here today. And so I'm going to spend some time to talk about the facts of this particular case. I hesitate a little bit to talk about the facts of the case because I don't want to traumatize the people who were in this courtroom. But I also feel like if we just simply ignore what happened in this incident and just simply gloss over it, that we aren't doing justice to why we're here today. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and I apologize if this traumatizes any of the family. I think it's important, though, that it be acknowledged. So one supposes, I think, that I know a lot about this case. But the reality is that I know what most of you in this courtroom know about this case. What I know about this case is what's contained in the court file. I'm not the prosecutor in this case. I'm not the defense attorney in this case. I understand there was 1,000 or more pages of discovery in this case. And really what I know about this case is summed up in 5 pages of probable cause in the court file. But that being said, what I know about what happened in August of 2014 to Janice Wright is more tragic that any words can describe. And it's worth noting that this incident didn't just traumatize Janice's family or Mr. Gaeta's family, but also traumatized the entire Kitsap County community. This crime was front page news for several days. The community as a whole was shocked by this case, was traumatized, and I think to this extent probably still remains traumatized by this case. As everybody in this room knows, that on August 3rd, Janice's family reported to the sheriff's office that they were unable to locate her. Days of searching for Janice followed, culminating in the discovery of her bloody clothing and ultimately the discovery of her body in a muddy bog. An autopsy was performed on August 8th of 2014. The autopsy revealed that she was killed by homicide. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head, resulting in multiple skull fractures, evidence of a sexual assault, evidence of strangulation by ligature. It was also determined that she had been moved half an hour to 3 hours after her death. Now I just read to you a summary of the autopsy that was contained essentially in the probable cause statement submitted to the court. And that statement cannot truly describe the terror and the brutality of this crime committed against this tiny 6-year-old child by the defendant, who was a nearly adult-sized man. The reality of which from this crime is truly difficult to contemplate. As the investigation continued, DNA tests revealed that Mr. Gaeta was connected to this crime. And as everybody knows, and I've already mentioned, on February 16th, 2018, Mr. Gaeta admitted to committing this crime, specifically detailed in a very generic way, but specific enough for the court at paragraph 11 that he committed this crime. And this plea, which is to Mr. Gaeta's credit, taking responsibility, but it also brings some finality to some folks in this room who might have had some doubt as to what happened, because it's without a doubt that Mr. Gaeta was the person who committed this crime and is going to be held truly responsible for it. And as I've said before, I'm going to say it again, that while there's no doubt as to who committed this crime, the eternal question is, in this case, and may always be, why? What is it that led up to the defendant, a young man with no criminal history, to go to the extreme of going from nothing in his past to raping and killing by strangulation a very young child? And honestly, I wish I had an answer to that question, and I don't know that it really ultimately will change how the family feels about what occurred. I imagine it probably could never do that. But for me, as a sentencing judge, it's the question that tumbles around in my head over and over again as I try to figure out what is the right result for this particular case. How do I apply the Miller factors? How do I judge this young man sitting here today who was a child himself at the time that he committed this crime? And it's almost impossible to find a conclusion to that if you don't have the answer to the question of why. So before I talk more about Mr. Gaeta and I issue my decision on sentencing, I'm just going to take a moment to talk about Janice. This child who was lost in August, I'm not sure we know exactly what date that this happened, but somewhere around August 3rd or 2nd. This little girl, I appreciate the comments that were made by everybody today trying to bring life back to this person who I've never met. You all have had the benefit of knowing this child, which I will never have the opportunity to have, and so I appreciate the comments made by the family, the anecdotes, the stories about how she affected your life and brought more joy to your life. She is obviously a very special child, and I'm very truly sorry for your loss. This little girl who never had a chance in life to even start the first grade, in a life that was cut short in truly every meaningful way. As I gather myself a little bit here, the pictures that were given to the court brought life back to the court in terms of who she was, and were truly heartrending, almost too difficult to really to look at. So the loss of this child is more tragic than anything I can say, and I just want to acknowledge who we're really here about today. So the two parties in this case, the state and the defense, have presented a joint plea agreement to the court. And as when this occurs, the court needs to very strongly consider the recommendations that are made to the court by the parties who have the benefit of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of their case, that understand the impact that a trial would have on the family, the victims, how this would be a difficult process for everyone. And really to also take into consideration that Mr. Gaeta ultimately took responsibility for his actions, which is not something that everybody does, and is something, though of little consolation, is something in his favor today. And as noted earlier, the existence of a plea agreement, the statement of a defendant on plea of guilty, puts to rest for the very end the question of who did this crime, and it can be without any doubt. You only get one life. That's just a reality, and this case itself demonstrates that in such an acute and final way. No matter what I do today, two lives, including Mr. Gaeta's, have been lost forever and truly wasted. If I follow the recommendation of 40 years in this case, the defendant is going to be 57 or almost 58 years old when he first has the opportunity for parole. To some, such as the defendant, this might seem like a de facto life sentence. Serving 40 years will mean that he'll have no meaningful opportunity to ever live a normal adult life. He'll be in the prison system when the rest of the world will be getting married, moving on with their life, having a job, having a career, building a retirement, doing all the things that we all take for granted. When he exits the prison system, he'll be in his late middle age to early elderly years. For those of us who are in closer to that age, that still seems like a lot of life to live when he gets out of prison. So the question is, on balance, whether or not this is truly the fairest sentence. And as I've already discussed, I've been required to consider whether the sentence is appropriate in light of the Miller factors presented to the court. And as I've already discussed in detail, what I really know about the defendant is fairly limited. And what I really need to know about the defendant is non-existent. I can say without a doubt, and it almost goes without saying, that if Mr. Gaeta was a 30-year-old man, there would be no hesitation to give him what the law requires me to give him, which would be mandatory life imprisonment without parole. I would have no hesitation and no difficulty doing that. Because a mature, fully mature adult who does what the defendant did to Janice should never walk free on our streets again. But Mr. Gaeta is not that person. Mr. Gaeta is was a 17-year-old child who suffered from some mental illness, who had some negative life experiences, and truly at the time that this crime was committed did not have the capacity to think like a fully formed adult, to make decisions like a fully formed adult. And again, I don't know if he had been that 30-year-old person, if this crime would have occurred, because again, I don't know why it happened, but the reality is that his age is a significant factor in this case. While it might feel very good to throw Mr. Gaeta away, and something I understand the family sentiments on that, I understand some of the statements and some of the letters about never letting him see the light of day again. I'm satisfied that such a sentence under the law would not satisfy the requirements of the 8th Amendment. Therefore, it's my conclusion, after considering all the facts of this case, the information that was presented today in court during the sentencing hearing, that the parties have reached a fair resolution in this case. I am going to follow the plea agreement that the parties have recommended. I'm going to impose the minimum 40-year sentence on count 1, impose the maximum penalty on count 3 of 123 months, which will run concurrent with count 1. I'm going to waive all of the mandatory legal financial obligations. I have no doubt Mr. Gaeta will never be in a position to pay those legal financial obligations. I will impose all the provisions that are required and set forth in Appendix X of the pre-sentence investigation. Any questions?
Your Honor, specifically on the legal and financial obligations, and that's just the DNA and
I think
what
there's
are you
5
worried?
victims.
And the 5 crime victims.
I think those are all that are remaining at this time, right?
Yes, Your Honor, that is.
I'm assuming because of his prior history, he's never conducted a DNA sample before, and so that would be mandatory. Because I think if they've done it before, it's no longer mandatory.
That's correct.
Ms. LaCrosse, any questions?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. Did we do the firearm notification previously?
We did that, Chief.
Are you doing a restitution, Simerson?
Yes, Your Honor, I suppose we should.
Should that be on the department?
Yes.
I think it's on Trey's side.
The normal date for this week is 9/21.
That would be a Friday,
Right.
2:30. Mr. Knight, that'll be at 2:30.
2:30.
Do we have Appendix F? Okay.
It's attached here.
Ms. Cross, is Mr. Gaeta waiving his appearance on the restitution sign set?
Yes.
Your Honor, I don't know that findings of facts are required, but I think I'd feel more comfortable if we do present the court with findings and conclusions on the Miller factors specifically. Does the court have any preference?
I don't. The question is, does Mr. Gaeta need to be present?
That is a
for
question.
Ms. LaCrosse?
Well, I can't answer off the top of my head whether he needs to be here for that.
I have them underway, so they can be done fairly quickly. I imagine we could do them this week. Unless the court thinks they're not necessary, but
Well, it's really unclear. The law is evolving, and it's probably safer than sorry to do them. When would he be leaving?
It could be tomorrow, it could be Thursday.
Would you do it before Thursday?
I sure can.
Can we keep him here till Thursday to make sure we have a chance? That would be either tomorrow or Wednesday.
If we could set it for Wednesday, that would be preferable.
My client says that he would be willing to waive his presence at that. I got to.
Is that acceptable?
I think he can constitutionally waive his presence at that. That would give us a little more time in case there's some discussion.
So, Mr. Gaeta, you've had enough time to talk to your lawyer about waiving your appearance for this hearing we're talking about? Okay. And you understand that if there's any issue and your attorney needs to talk to you about it, I would give her time to take a break and reach out to you in the prison. And can you guys scoot a little bit? Mr. Enright, scoot over. I'm trying to talk to Mr. Gaeta. That I would, if necessary, if Ms. LaCrosse has any concerns, I could recess it so we can either have a chance for her to talk to you or bring it back if necessary. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Because we haven't seen them yet, so we don't know what they're going to say. But you're okay not being present for that hearing? Okay. And so I'll accept that as a waiver. We can set it on a departmental.
Why don't we do this, Your Honor? Why don't we just, Ms. LaCrosse and I will discuss it, we'll see if we can agree, and then we'll either note it or maybe we
Okay.
can present it.
Okay. Ms. LaCrosse, that work for you?
That does.
Okay. So I'll assume that Mr. Gaeta does not need to be here, and Ms. LaCrosse, if you think for whatever reason he does need to be here, then we'll address that as well.
Okay.
Okay. Anything further?
Not for the state, thank you.
Okay. Ms. LaCrosse, anything further?
No.
Okay. We're at recess.
All rise.
Please have a seat and we'll see it until Mr. Gaeta is out of the courtroom.